bit.
What the hell?
Hey, Moneybag, do you want a demonstration? Well, then feast your eyes on this.
There is a moment in cinema history where one film quietly changed everything. Not with explosions, not with a billion-dollar budget, not with a franchise launch or a cinematic universe. Just one man, a makeup chair, a rubber suit, and an idea so bold that most people in Hollywood told him it would never work. That film was The Nutty Professor, released in the summer of 1996, and it did not just succeed at the box office, it detonated. It redefined what a black comedian could do in a major studio film. It reset the entire conversation about performance, transformation, physical comedy, and the courage it takes to make an audience laugh while simultaneously making them feel something real. But behind every frame of that movie, behind every pratfall and every tearful dinner table moment, there were stories that never made it into the press junket interviews, secrets that stayed on the lot, choices that were argued over in conference rooms, and facts so bizarre and so fascinating that even the most devoted fans of this film have likely never heard all of them. So tonight, we are going to go deep. We are going to peel back the latex, so to speak, and look at the true story of how the Nutty Professor got made, what it cost, what it risked, and what it gave the world that we are still feeling nearly 3 decades later. Eddie Murphy did not want to play multiple characters at first. That is a fact that tends to surprise people, because the multi-character performance is now so permanently associated with this film that it seems inseparable from the concept. But in the early stages of development, Murphy was resistant to the idea of playing the entire Klump family at the dinner table. He had already done multiple characters in Coming to America, and he was wary of it feeling like a repeat. What changed his mind, according to people close to the production, was the script itself. When he read the dinner table scene, the one where Sherman, Cletus, Ida Mae, and the grandparents all sit together, he started performing the voices in his head and realized there was something completely different happening here. These were not sketch characters. These were people. They had weight. They had history with each other. They interrupted each other the way real families do. And once he found that texture, the resistance dissolved entirely. He stopped seeing it as a gimmick and started seeing it as a story. The makeup process for the fat suit and prosthetics was so extensive that Eddie Murphy had to arrive on set 4 to 5 hours before anyone else. The team from Rick Baker's studio, which was responsible for most of the transformative work, had developed a system of layered foam latex appliances that covered Murphy's face, neck, hands, and portions of his body. Each piece had to be applied in sequence, blended meticulously, and then painted to match the underlying skin tone under the specific lighting conditions of whatever set they were shooting that day. Some days, particularly during the dinner table scenes where Murphy was playing multiple Klump family members back to back, the team would spend the entire morning just cycling through the removal and reapplication of different pieces. Murphy has said in subsequent interviews that the experience gave him a profound respect for character actors who work in heavy prosthetics regularly. He also admitted that the physical discomfort was real and consistent, particularly in warm interiors, where the foam latex retained heat against his skin. There were days, he said, when the first thing he did after calling cut was sit completely still and just breathe. Rick Baker won the Academy Award for Best Makeup for his work on The Nutty Professor. That is the headline most people know. What fewer people know is that the nomination itself was controversial within the Academy's makeup branch, not because the work was not extraordinary, but because of an ongoing debate about whether extensive prosthetic character transformation belonged in the same category as more subtle or naturalistic makeup work. Baker had already won the award before, for An American Werewolf in London, for Gorillas in the Mist, and he would go on to win it several more times after Nutty Professor. But the 1997 win was particularly significant because it validated the idea that full-body comic transformation was worthy of the same serious artistic recognition as any dramatic makeup achievement. The industry took note, and so did a generation of makeup artists who were watching from home. Jada Pinkett Smith was cast as Carla Purdy, the love interest, and her chemistry with Eddie Murphy during their first read-through was reportedly so natural and warm that the director, Tom Shadyac, moved several scenes earlier in the shooting schedule just to capture what he described as the most genuine romantic energy he had seen in years of making films. Pinkett Smith brought a groundedness to Carla that the script had not fully accounted for on the page. She made Carla three-dimensional in a way that elevated every scene she shared with Murphy's Sherman Klump. The scene at the restaurant, where Carla laughs genuinely at Sherman's discomfort with the pretentious waiter, became one of the most watched clips from the film in the years after its release. Not because of any special effect or stunt, but because of the realness of her laughter. That laugh was not scripted. It was just her reacting to Murphy, and Shadyac was smart enough to keep the camera rolling. The original Nutty Professor, released in 1963, starred Jerry Lewis and was based very loosely on the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When Eddie Murphy and his team approached the idea of a remake, they made a conscious decision very early in the development process to honor the premise without being bound by it. The transformation at the center of Lewis's film was about social awkwardness, becoming suave confidence. Murphy's team wanted something more personal, more culturally specific, and more emotionally honest. The decision to root the transformation in a story about weight, self-acceptance, and the internalized standards that Black Americans, and specifically Black men, are often pressured to meet was a deliberate and significant reframe. It took the skeleton of a classic comedy and put entirely new flesh on it, which, given the subject matter, is perhaps the most appropriate metaphor imaginable. James Coburn plays Dean Richmond in the film, and his casting tells an interesting story about what kind of film this was trying to be. Coburn was a major Hollywood figure, a genuine movie star from an earlier era, and his presence in what was marketed as a broad studio comedy was unusual. But Shadyac had a specific vision for the Dean Richmond character as a genuine antagonist, not a cartoon villain, but a man of institutional power who represents the kind of gatekeeping that's smart, unconventional people run into throughout their lives. Having Coburn in that role gave the conflict real weight. When Dean Richmond threatens Sherman's career and his research, it does not feel like a sitcom obstacle. It feels like something real. That grounding was essential to the film's ability to shift emotional registers as cleanly as it does. The Klump family dinner scene, the one most people cite as the comedic peak of the entire film, was shot over the course of 4 days. This was not because of technical difficulties, though the choreography of having Murphy in different makeups, shot from different angles and then composited together, was genuinely complex. It was because Murphy kept finding new things in each character with each take. The character of Cletus Klump, Sherman's brother, for example, started as a relatively minor presence in the scene. By the 3rd day of shooting, Cletus had become a supporting comedic engine in his own right, with Murphy discovering rhythms and reactions that pulled the character into sharper focus with every pass. Editors working on the sequence reportedly had an extraordinary volume of material and had to resist the temptation to use all of it, because each take had something worth keeping. The film was made on a budget of approximately $60 million. That was a significant number in 1996, but what made it particularly striking was that a substantial portion of that budget went directly into the prosthetics, the multiple character technical work, and the post-production compositing required to put Eddie Murphy in the same frame as himself multiple times. The studio, Universal Pictures, was betting heavily on Murphy's ability to carry the film, and they knew that the technical spectacle of watching him transform and multiply was going to be a central selling point. The bet paid off extravagantly. The Nutty Professor grossed over $270 million worldwide against that $60 million budget, making it one of the most profitable films of 1996 and one of the most successful comedies of the entire decade. There is a running theme in The Nutty Professor about the relationship between intelligence and acceptance that is easy to miss if you are watching it primarily as a comedy. Sherman Klump is a brilliant scientist. He is accomplished, respected in his field, genuinely kind, and capable of authentic connection. His struggle is not intellectual or professional. His struggle is entirely internal, rooted in a deeply conditioned belief that his body makes him unworthy of love or admiration in a world that has told him otherwise his entire life. The buddy love transformation is not just a physical change. It is the externalization of every internalized message Sherman has received about what kind of man he is supposed to be. What the film argues, ultimately and surprisingly for a studio comedy, is that the buddy love version is not liberation, it is prison. That is a sophisticated idea dressed up in foam, latex, and physical comedy. And the fact that it lands is a testament to how seriously everyone involved took the material beneath the spectacle. Murphy wrote no fewer than 3 versions of the buddy love character before arriving at the final version seen in the film. Early drafts reportedly made Buddy much more overtly menacing, almost predatory in his interactions with women, in a way that tested poorly with preview audiences and felt tonally inconsistent with the warmth that the Sherman sections of the film had established. A second version swung in the opposite direction and made Buddy too clownish, which undermined the idea that Sherman might actually prefer being him. The final version, the buddy love that ended up on screen, is charismatic and funny and charming in a shallow, recognizable way, while still showing enough ugliness underneath to make his scenes genuinely uncomfortable. Finding that balance where the audience could understand the appeal of Buddy while simultaneously rejecting what he represented was reportedly one of the hardest creative problems the film had to solve. Dave Chappelle appears in The Nutty Professor in one of his early film roles, playing Reggie Warrington, the student comedian who humiliates Sherman at a comedy club in the film's most emotionally devastating scene. Chappelle was 22 years old at the time of filming and had not yet achieved the broader stardom that would come in subsequent years. His performance in that scene is remarkable, not because of anything flashy or showy, but because of the precision of his cruelty. Reggie is not a random antagonist. He is a specific kind of comic performer who uses someone else's vulnerability as material, and Chappelle plays that with enough authenticity to make the scene genuinely painful. What makes the performance particularly striking in retrospect is knowing what Chappelle would eventually become. Watching him in that scene, you can already see the instincts of a generational comedian at work. The timing, the read of the room, the understanding of exactly how far to push a moment before it breaks. He was not a supporting player stumbling through a bit part. He was a young artist making every single second count. There is a reason audiences are uncomfortable when that scene plays. It is not because the comedy is mean. It is because the comedy is recognizable. The scene in which Sherman attends the comedy club and is publicly humiliated is, by almost every account from the production, the scene that Murphy himself cared most about getting right. He reportedly spent more time in rehearsal on Sherman's reactions in that scene than on any other sequence in the film, including the elaborate dinner table composite work. The reason was that this scene was the emotional pivot of the entire story. Everything that comes before it is context. Everything that comes after it is consequence. If the audience did not feel the specific weight of what happened to Sherman in that club, in front of Carla, in front of a room full of strangers, the entire emotional architecture of the film would collapse. Murphy understood that the comedy in the rest of the movie only works if the pain in this scene is real. The film's score was composed by David Newman, who worked within the framework of a classic Hollywood comedy tradition, while also incorporating elements that reflected the cultural specificity of the story's world. But the soundtrack, separate from the score, was a significant cultural event in its own right. The Nutty Professor soundtrack featured contributions from major R&B and hip-hop artists of the moment and sold millions of copies independently of the film. The lead single, a collaboration that captured the energy of the mid-90s black music scene at its commercial peak, received extensive radio play and helped extend the film's cultural footprint well beyond its theatrical run. It is worth pausing on what that actually meant in 1996. A film's soundtrack reaching that level of cultural saturation meant it was playing in cars, in barbershops, in living rooms, in school hallways, in places that had no screen and no projector but were still spreading the film's identity into the world. The music became a calling card, a shorthand for an entire cultural moment. And for people who had not yet seen the film, the soundtrack was often the first point of contact. In an era before streaming, before social media, before the kind of algorithmic recommendation that now shapes how music and film interact, the Nutty Professor soundtrack did it the old way. Through radio, through record stores, through people making copies for their friends, and it worked. Tom Shadyac, who directed the film, had previously made Ace Ventura, Pet Detective with Jim Carrey, and the experience of working with a physical comedian of that caliber had prepared him in certain ways for the challenges of directing Eddie Murphy in a role that required constant physical and emotional transformation. But he has said in interviews that directing Murphy on The Nutty Professor was fundamentally different from anything he had done before, because Murphy was not just performing characters, he was performing an argument. Every scene, every comedic choice, every moment of physical transformation was in service of a specific point the film was trying to make about identity, self-worth, and the cost of pretending to be someone other than yourself. Shadyac described his job on this film as primarily protective, making sure that the emotional core stayed intact, even as the technical and comedic demands multiplied. Universal Pictures had actually considered multiple directors and multiple lead actors before the project arrived at its final configuration. There was a version of this film, early in its development, that did not have Eddie Murphy attached at all. The project had been in some form of development for years before Murphy became involved, and it was his specific creative vision, his insistence on certain thematic elements and on the multi-character approach that transformed it from a relatively conventional remake into something more ambitious. This is worth noting because it illustrates something important about how black films get made in Hollywood, which is that very often the transformative creative decisions happen when the black artist in question has enough leverage to insist. Murphy had that leverage in 1996. He had built it through 2 decades of work, and he used it. The film's climax, in which Sherman confronts Buddy Love and refuses to become him again, was reshot at least twice during production. The original ending was reportedly more ambiguous, leaving open the possibility that Buddy might return under certain circumstances. Preview audiences found this unsatisfying and somewhat troubling, reading it as a suggestion that Sherman had not fully resolved his internal conflict. The reshoot moved toward a cleaner resolution, one that was more explicitly hopeful, without being falsely tidy. The version that ended up in the final cut has Sherman standing fully in his own skin, imperfect and brilliant and worthy, and earning the moment without the film having to announce it with too much ceremony. Getting that balance right between resolution and sentimentality was something the editing team worked on until very late in the post-production process. The Nutty Professor was not just a commercial success. It was a critical recalibration of how Eddie Murphy's career was discussed. Murphy had spent the early 90s in a run of films that, while not failures, had not captured the cultural energy of his peak Beverly Hills Cop and Coming to America years. There was a mainstream media narrative, the kind that attached itself to black entertainers in particular during that era, that Murphy had passed his moment. The Nutty Professor did not just refute that narrative, it shredded it. Critics who had been writing Murphy off for years found themselves writing rave reviews and reconsidering their earlier dismissals. The performance was impossible to dismiss, not because it was flashy, though it was, but because underneath the prosthetics and the physical comedy, there was emotional intelligence that demanded to be acknowledged. The Nutty Professor received a sequel in 2000, Nutty Professor 2, The Klumps, which brought back the full Klump family and added Janet Jackson to the cast. That film had its own significant commercial success, grossing over $160 million worldwide. But the general consensus, even among fans of the franchise, is that the sequel is a bigger, louder, more complicated machine that never quite recaptures the specific alchemy of the original. The original worked because it had something to say and a reason to be. The sequel worked because audiences loved the characters and wanted more time with them. Those are not the same thing, and the difference shows in the experience of watching them back to back. The original leaves you feeling something. The sequel leaves you feeling entertained. Entertainment is not nothing, but it is not the same. The Nutty Professor was entered into the Library of Congress National Film Registry in 2018, which means it was formally deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant by the official body responsible for preserving American cinema. This is not a commercial honor. Films do not get selected for the registry because they made money. They get selected because they represent something meaningful about who we were and what we cared about at a particular moment in history. The inclusion of the Nutty Professor in that registry is in some ways the most significant recognition the film has ever received. because it places it alongside the most important works in American film history and says, without qualification, that this matters. This was not just a summer comedy. This was a document. This was a mirror. And then there is the thing that is hardest to quantify, but easiest to feel, which is the way the Nutty Professor changed what young black audiences thought was possible in mainstream cinema. In 1996, there were not many films where a black man could be the romantic lead and the comic genius, and the emotional center of a $200 million movie simultaneously. There were not many films where a black family could be depicted with warmth and absurdity, and love and dysfunction all at once, without any of those qualities being in tension with the others. There were not many films where the message at the heart of a big summer studio release was that your body is not the problem. The world's relationship with your body is the problem, and you do not owe anyone a different version of yourself just because they are not comfortable with the real one. The Nutty Professor said that. It said it loudly, it said it hilariously, and it said it to an enormous audience that was ready to hear it, even if they did not know they were ready until it was already over. What makes a film like this last is not the technical achievement, though the technical achievement is real and remarkable. It is not the box office numbers, though they are astonishing. It is not even the individual brilliance of the performance, though that brilliance is undeniable. What makes a film like this last is the specific combination of courage and craft and cultural honesty that produces something no one else could have made at that exact moment. Eddie Murphy in 1996, with everything he had built and everything he had learned and everything he was willing to risk, made a film that could only have come from exactly him, exactly then. That is the rarest thing in Hollywood. That is the thing the sequels and the remakes and the franchise extensions almost never capture. That is the thing that puts a comedy about a fat suit and a synthetic identity formula in the National Film Registry alongside Casablanca and Citizen Kane. Not because they are the same kind of film, but because they are all doing the same essential thing, which is telling the truth about what it means to be human in the most vivid and specific and unforgettable way they can manage. The Nutty Professor is not a perfect film. No film is, but it is an honest one. And in an industry and an era that rewarded dishonesty, that made dishonesty practically a job requirement, choosing honesty, choosing to put the real thing on screen even when the fake version would have been safer and cheaper and easier. That is what 27 years of conversation and counting looks like. That is what the makeup chair and the 4 a.m. call times and the rewritten endings and the reshoot schedules were all in service of. Not a product, not a franchise, a film, one that asked a very simple question and answered it very clearly. The question was, is it enough to be exactly who you are? And the answer, delivered in foam latex and family dinners and genuine laughter, was yes. It has always been enough. It has always been more than enough.